Hey teacher friends, I'm Jennifer Bodie with Moving Forward in Education, and today I'm going to talk to you guys all about teaching line plots. So some of the things we're going to cover in this video are the vertical articulation of line plots, and that is moving from like second grade all the way up through fifth grade, which are your technical line plot standards. We will talk a little bit about what happens in sixth grade as well. They kind of move past line plots. We're going to talk about common mistakes students make. We will talk about like how to progress your lessons as you are teaching, and different types of questions you're going to ask while analyzing. So I hope that you learn some takeaways from this video, and stick around and let me know down in the comments any suggestions you have for teaching line plots, because as a former third, fourth, and now fifth grade teacher, I know that this can be a super hard skill for students to wrap their heads around, especially now as we are seeing a lot of gaps from everything that happened in 2020 to now. It has been very interesting. So we will talk all about the progression of this skill and how we can make sure our students are successful. I wanted to jump in and take a look at the vertical articulation. So the actual line plot standards are second, third, fourth, and fifth grade. So I have up on my screen the Common Core standard. Your state may or may not use Common Core, but they should be very similar to Common Core. I am in a state that doesn't use Common Core, but there's only one little difference, and I'll talk about that. You can definitely pull your own standards and look at this. So in second grade, they are supposed to generate measurement data by measuring lengths of several objects to the nearest whole unit. So that's going to be your whole inches, whole centimeters, just your wholes. They're not looking at fractional pieces in the second grade. And then they are going to show their measurements on a line plot. Okay, so this is, they are measuring to generate their own data and to the nearest whole, and they are plotting it. Second grade should also be the first year that they're actually measuring to the nearest whole. In first grade, if you are a second grade teacher, you might want to know where they're coming from. So in first grade, all they have to do is order objects from like largest to smallest or smallest to largest, and then they have to represent that data up to 3 categories. It is not very specific, at least in Common Core, how they represent that data. Okay, so then we move into third grade. And in third grade, they introduced fractional pieces. So they are still measuring their data using rulers to the half or quarter inch. And then they're going to show their data on the line plot. So that's the second grade and third grade standard is very similar in that they measure their data and then they put it on a line plot. The only difference is that third grade is using those halves and quarters. And when we move into fourth grade, they are making a line plot with halves, quarters, and eighths. And then they have to solve problems using addition and subtraction. So this is the first time they're actually having to use anything other than counting. They're having to use some computation, and it is very specific to addition and subtraction. They're also adding in the eighths. Now this is the Common Core standard, and I am not in a Common Core state. So one difference that we have with our fourth grade standard is our fourth graders have to measure to generate their own data. So just double check that. We make our fourth graders measure to the nearest eighth inch. Common Core says they don't have to measure. They're just given their data. So just look at that. Sometimes there's little differences, but they're pretty similar. When we move into the fifth grade, it still only goes up to the eighths. Okay. We do not make our fifth graders measure. okay? It is all about being able to put the numbers on a line plot and being able to answer questions. Now, 5th grade is open to all 4 operations: multiplication, division, addition, subtraction with fractions. So there is that. Also, one thing I noticed in 5th grade is the number lines tend to actually be in quarters, halves, and eighths, whereas like in 4th grade, they tend to all be in quarters or halves. So that's just something to keep in mind too. They're going to have that knowledge of equivalent fractions and know how to do operations with fractions with unlike denominators. Now, when they are moving into 6th grade, like if you're a 5th grade teacher and want to push your students a little bit further, they are still going to have to plot numbers on number lines. They do this 3 different ways in 6th grade. So the first is a dot plot, which is basically a number line, and we'll look at one of these later. It's a number line with circles. I actually go ahead and introduce dot plots to my 5th graders as another way to do a number line, because other than number lines having X's and dot plots having circles, they are essentially the same. The next thing 6th graders will have to do is histograms. They should have done histograms in 3rd grade, but not necessarily on a formal number line like they will in 6th grade. And a histogram is just a bar graph with no spaces in between the data bars. And then they will move into a box plot or a box and whisker plot. And this is also on a number line, but it gets a little more complex because they're going to have to identify the median, the min, the max, and the upper and lower quartiles. So it does kind of build on itself. So if you want to know where to kind of send your students, that is where. Okay. Next, we are going to look at common mistakes students make when creating line plots. So I have up my actual unit that I use with my 5th grade students. I always teach my students as though they know nothing from their previous years and only have to use the skills that I have taught them. So I go back to the basics and start off with what is a line plot and explain that it is just a number line, because some of them do not understand that a number line can be used to make a graph. Then I jump right into the X's or dots. So I go ahead and tell my students that a line plot may have data represented by X's or dots, because they do end up seeing these dots even though they're technically a 6th grade thing. And I don't go into the fact that these are called dot plots and these are called line plots, because as you can see, they represent data the same exact way, but I want them to be familiar with seeing them both ways. Their 6th grade teachers can tell them this is technically a dot plot. If you want to tell them that, that's fine. Then I talk about how we can partition our wholes into halves. Don't just assume that because your students did this in 3rd and 4th grade that they don't know it. Measurement and data standards are usually something that is going through really fast at the end of the year, and students really don't have time to apply it and spiral back to it during the year, so they forget it. So I start at the basics. We start with halves. And I teach them how to partition their number line into halves explicitly. And then we get into mistakes, because I like to teach this on the front end, because I see this and I see it and I see it and I see it throughout my whole units. And they always do this. So I have them look at this messed up dot plot. You could do something similar if you wanted. You could totally use a line plot with X's, but I asked them a question like, how many dots are on the 1 and how many are on the 1/2? Because it's really hard to tell, you know, are my data points on the hole, the first hole, going like this and then like this, or is it just up to here and then the 4 goes, or I'm sorry, the 1/2 goes this way? I mean, and they can't answer the question. And I want them to be able to see that so they know when they do this on their paper, I won't be able to know what they're talking about either. And then I ask them to identify all the things that are wrong with it. So we kind of talk about, the different starting points, like how this 4 looks like it has more data than the 5, just because the 5 started much lower than the 4 did. We also look at spacing, we look at straightness, and we spend time talking about all of those things because your students will do these, especially if they are doing it with a paper and pencil. If you are doing paper and pencil, I highly recommend teaching your students how to do this on graph paper. If you are on Google Slides and they are kind of manipulating the figures to create their own dot plot or line plot, then I would show them how to line them up. And I'll show you that in just a second. This is a line plot that I use for one of my questions with my students. And if you are using Google Slides like I am here, you can move it and you see these red lines will actually guide you. So you see how it's through the center here? That lets me know, even though I'm way over here, that it's exactly lined up. If I'm right here, it's not. So you can show them how to use these vertical and horizontal lines to make sure that their data is completely lined up. Super simple and helps keep them organized. Okay, friends, so we have talked about the vertical articulation of the standards, and we have also talked about teaching some common mistakes. And in that clip, we kind of started talking about the progression of teaching number lines. So you kind of saw how I do it, and that is teaching them how to create the number line, and then I talk about how to analyze it. So there are 2 different beliefs on this, and you can choose what works best for your teaching style. Some people like to just give their students line plots and then analyze them and let them work with them for a while, and then have them create it. Some people like to do what I do and have them create their line plots and then analyze it. I feel like if I'm having them create it, it drives home that point that, each X represents 1, which is, it also goes back to some of the mistakes with analyzing the line plots, because we ask them computational questions and they just want to look at the numbers on their number line rather than the amount of data points they have above that number. So that's why I do it the way I do, and I'm going to kind of show you my own personal unit and how I kind of progress through it. I teach number lines roughly like 5 days of explicit, 4 days of explicit instruction, and then I do 1 really guided hands-on day, and then I let them, we have like a review day. I'll talk about some different options you can do there, and then we do our test. So really the whole entire unit from start to finish is 7 days. All right, let's dive in and look at how I progress, guys, about how I first kind of introduce the wholes, and then I will show my students how to partition their number line. Now, here is something I do on purpose, and if you notice, my halves are slightly shorter than my wholes. I do that because that's how it will be in real life on rulers and tape measures, and we talk about how the longest line is your wholes and the shortest line is your halves. Because I also tell them, sometimes these fractions won't be labeled, and they won't. They'll just have to know what comes in between the numbers that are labeled. So I kind of show them that. On the next day is when I talk about fourths, and I explain to them that we have to partition in between the whole and the half and the next whole, and those are fourths. And I also made these slightly shorter. For the first 3 days, I kind of keep these color coordinated so they can really get that visual. The other thing that I really drive home is that a half equals 2/4, and that sometimes your data may say 2/4 or it may say 1/2. And sometimes your number line will say 2/4 or it may say 1/2. So I kind of go into forcing them to do both to get them really comfortable with those equivalent fractions. So on this one, I have data with 2/4 and they have to be able to plot that on halves. And then I turn around and have data with halves that they have to plot on 2/4. So we kind of look at it both ways. The next day we introduce the eighths. So I talk about how the eighths are going to go in between the whole and the quarter and the quarter and the half and the 3/4 and the in between the 3/4 and the next whole. And I have these slightly shorter and also a different color to kind of help guide them. The other thing I did on purpose was I have a broken number line. So I did not start it with a whole. They're going to have to be able to count backwards. So they're going to have to know that this is 7 7/8 and this is 7 3/4. We also talk about equivalent fractions here to know that 2/8 equals 1/4 and 4/8 equals 1/2 and 6/8 equals 3/4 and 1/2 and 2/4 and 4/8, they're all the same. Because that's hard for them. That's a whole different skill that they start in 4th grade. And from my experience as a 4th grade math teacher, they just don't really retain it in 4th grade. So they definitely need that explicit instruction, which we do give them in 5th grade with equivalent fractions. But they probably need some explicit instruction again. When we move into day 4, that is when I start showing them different kinds of line plots like this one. The data is on there. It looks very similar to mine, except it's not color coordinated. You can see the different links are different sizes. All of the lines are labeled though, so that's kind of helpful. This is also a great time to integrate your customary metric system if you want to get some review or teaching in on measurement conversions. And we talk about how that looks as fractions. They really have to think here when I'm talking about this whole number line or line plot is in pints or is representing pints. And I ask them questions about cups. And I kind of guide them through that. I'm like, how many cups are in a pint? And if they don't know it, I have my students use their inquiry skills and look it up on Google. Because I can't just feed them information forever. They need to know how to go and retrieve that information. So then they tell me that, well, there's 2 cups in a pint. So I said, okay, well, where would the 1 cup go? So they have to know that 1 cup would be half of a pint since there's 2 in there. And then we just talk about how to answer different kinds of questions. This is really, more simple stuff. This one is, counting. So they're not very complex questions, but let's see. Yeah, these are all like counting questions. And then on day 5, I really like to have my students do it independently or in small groups because they are capable. We have given them all the skills they need to be successful. They just have to turn their thinking brains on and think and apply what they know, which is good for them. So I am there to guide them through this. I give them, what I call a problematic task. Excuse me, sorry. And I give them information they need, like the conversions. 8 pints is 1 gallon, 4 quarts is a gallon. Obviously, a half gallon there are 2 of them. And then they're going to have to use this word form data to make their own. And then they're going to answer more and more complex questions. And let's go ahead and dive into the types of questions because that was the last thing I wanted to talk about in this video. So we talked about, how to count the data, which is very basic. This is also more counting questions, but there is some conversions because they're, asking questions about quarts and then our line plot is in gallons. So they do have a little bit of conversions there. This one is a little bit of addition. They're having to add two different columns and compare them. Same with this one. Except instead of saying which one has more, they're asking exactly how much more. So then they're gonna have to do that subtraction to find the difference. In this question, they are gonna have to add up the total of all the jars and figure out what that equals, and if it's more or less than 8 gallons of water, and then they have to explain their thinking. Kind of going back to this Common Core standard, let's look at this real quick. This 5th grade Common Core standard, you can look at this for example. It says, for example, given different measurements of liquid in identical beakers, find the amount of liquid in each beaker each beaker would contain if the total amount of beakers were distributed equally. This is averages, guys, without using the word average. So that last question that I showed you where they had to add up the total amount, they will have to do that, and then they will have to divide it by the number of data points. So however many that was, I think it was like 17 or something I gave mine on this. So they would have to add up all of the points here. Oops, excuse me, sorry. They would have to add up all of these and then divide it by 17 to figure out basically what the average is. And if you want to tell them that they're finding averages, go for it. But that is kind of the most complex question that we get to. And I kind of talk about this on the review, which I am going to talk to you guys about too. So you can, do a standard review where you make questions and you kind of go over it with your whole class. I have made some boom cards and I have my students work through boom cards. I'm a virtual teacher. Hold on just a second. Okay, so like I was saying, I am a virtual teacher, so I'm able to put my students into breakout rooms and really get quality one-on-one time with my students, which is great because, in the traditional classroom, you're always going to have somebody interrupting you, and I don't have that issue with virtual. So I kind of hop around and see where students need help, or they can press that ask for help button, which you could do in, the regular classroom. You just have to have that management down, where they're working independently, and you can walk around and monitor them. They can raise their hand and ask you for help, but I will give them problems like this, to really push them just to see what they know. They learn so much better being forced to really think and pull their own skills and figuring out how to solve these problems on their own than if we just, give it to them. I'm a big believer in giving my students background knowledge, kind of modeling how to work through things, and then forcing them to apply their knowledge. And of course, I'm there to facilitate, I'm there to guide, but they are not going to really learn unless they are putting in the work. Now, that is all I wanted to talk about with line plots, and I really hope you had some takeaways. I feel like this was a lot more 5th grade focused, but hopefully you understand like why and how I teach line plots the way I do. So if you're like a 3rd grade teacher, maybe you are only showing them, obviously not the 8s, but you're showing them how to partition the number line into halves and then how to do it into quarters. 4th grade, you're going to have to show them all the steps, but you're going to stick to those, just the addition and subtraction and counting problems. You're not going to worry about finding the average or doing any kind of other multiplication or division type problem. So hopefully you can pick and take what you need from that and apply it in your classroom. Hopefully you can understand, where your students came from. Hopefully you can understand where they're going. I highly encourage you to start back at the basics like I did with the holes. Even if you move fast, like I moved from holes, talking about holes, to halves in the same day. And the holes are back to 2nd grade. Start at the basics. Spend that time on the front end and they're going to pick it up so much faster because they're not going to be sitting there confused of I'm sorry, my throat today, but they're not going to be sitting there like confused because they have those previous learning gaps. Even your higher students who are always, making A's and scoring above average, like they will get it, but they don't remember every single little thing. So if you spend a day or two, progressively going over the background, it's going to activate that light and all your students will be able to use it, right? And if you spend the time on the front end, I promise you the back end and the meat of your lessons are going to go so much quicker. Don't think you don't have time to do it. I promise you it is worth it, like every single time. All right, guys, that is it. If you enjoyed this video, which I hope you did, make sure that you are subscribed and hit your notification bell. I am going to be posting about content and different things with virtual teaching and organization. So I hope there's a little something here for everybody. I've had some major shifts since I last uploaded, and we'll get into that in another video. All right, guys, have a great day.